Navy SEALs had no line of sight. 12 hours on a ridgeline, watching a convoy die in the valley below, while an invisible enemy picked them apart from the rocks. America's deadliest warriors reduced to shooting shadows. Then a quiet woman stepped off a transport with a clipboard and a rucksack too heavy for paperwork. Inside was a Barrett .50, and the moment she raised it, everything changed. Before I show you what really happened that day, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The mountains looked endless from the ridge, jagged granite thrust into the clouds, sharp enough to slice the sky, while wind howled through narrow passes with the sound of tearing metal. The valley below was nothing but shifting haze, dust, smoke, and the faint echo of gunfire that made every man on the ridgeline stiffen. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Ridley squatted behind a boulder, scanning the horizon through his carbine scope. His jaw tightened until the muscles stood out like cables. No line of sight. Nothing but shadows moving between rocks a mile away, too distant and too well concealed to target. He pulled back from the scope, expression tight. "Same as before," he said. "They're dug in, masked by the terrain. We can't touch them." The other SEALs shifted uncomfortably. These were men who'd cut their teeth in Fallujah, Ramadi, Kandahar. They knew what it meant to face superior numbers, what it felt like to walk into fights where the odds were crushing. But they also knew how to adapt. Normally, this time the terrain itself mocked them. The ridgelines were a maze of jagged folds and shadowed bowls, natural choke points that gave their enemy every advantage. Two squads had tried this same Overwatch position in the past 3 months. Delta Team had lost 3 men to sniper fire they never saw coming. Charlie Squad had been forced to abandon the ridge entirely when mortar fire started walking up the slope with surgical precision. Both times the enemy had owned the high ground like they'd been born to it, and then she arrived. Warrant Officer Claire Redden stepped out of the transport vehicle with a rucksack slung over one shoulder. Mid-30s, lean but not imposing, hair tied back beneath her cap, wearing the kind of uniform that looked more suited for a supply office than a forward operating ridge. A clipboard was tucked into her pack straps, battered and scratched from years of use. Ridley spotted her coming across the rocks and shook his head. "You've got to be kidding me. They sent us an observer." Petty Officer Danner grinned without humor. "Guess they figure we need a babysitter." The others chuckled, but it was thin, brittle laughter. Everyone here knew what observation meant. Command didn't trust them to handle things alone. Claire walked with steady pace, unfazed by uneven terrain. Whipping wind or the wall of skepticism aimed her way. She stopped just outside the circle of stone the SEALs had been using for cover and gave Ridley a polite nod. "Chief," she said evenly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried in the mountain air. "Warrant Officer Claire Redden, here to observe fire coordination." Ridley didn't offer his hand. He just leaned back on his haunches, squinting at her with open irritation. "We don't need an observer. What we need is line of sight. Unless you've got a satellite in that clipboard, your excess weight." Claire didn't react. She just set her rucksack down and pulled out a small weather meter. She lifted it into the wind. adjusted the vein, glanced at the digital readout. Then she knelt, pressed her fingers against cold granite, and watched dust swirl off the cliff edge. One of the younger SEALs, Kowalski, frowned. What's she doing? Pretending to know what she's looking at, Ridley muttered. But Kowalski noticed something the others didn't. The way Claire's eyes narrowed as she studied currents twisting through the valley. How her fingers tapped against stone like she was marking invisible measurements. She wasn't fidgeting. She was calculating. And when she looked at the opposing ridgelines, her gaze didn't sweep randomly like someone trying to spot movement. It locked onto specific points, lingered on what looked like empty rock, then moved to the next position with the methodical precision of someone conducting a survey. Ma'am, Kowalski said quietly, you see something up there? Claire's response was carefully neutral, just getting familiar with the terrain. But the way she said it, like someone who'd gotten familiar with a lot of terrain over the years, made Kowalski exchange a glance with Santos. Fresh gunfire cracked from below, loud enough to make everyone's heads turn. Another volley from unseen shooters firing from somewhere the SEALs couldn't reach. Dust plumed on the far ridge. Ridley cursed. No line of sight, just shadows. Claire said nothing. She kept her eyes on the far ridgeline, face unreadable, like she was waiting for something only she could see. The SEALs spread out along the ridge, establishing firing arcs they'd done 100 times before. Sandbags shifted into place, tripods braced against stone, ammunition laid out within reach, because the fight always came quicker than you expected in this part of the world. Eyes sharp, Ridley called, voice clipped. Convoy's 10 minutes out. We hold this pass until they make it through. The men nodded, movements efficient and silent. These weren't green recruits. Everyone had carried their share of scars, some on skin, most in memory. They knew what it meant to hold a ridgeline, but they also knew this terrain was wrong. The angles were against them. The first incoming round proved it. The mortar shell didn't whistle, it screamed, hit 100 meters downslope, detonating in a geyser of stone and dirt that blasted skyward like a volcanic eruption. The shockwave hammered the ridge, rattling teeth and leaving ears ringing. Contact! Mortars! Santos! The comms man was already flipping through channels, trying to raise the convoy. Static hissed back. Another round landed closer, then another, bracketing them with methodical precision. Whoever was firing knew the range, knew the spacing. These weren't wild shots. They were plotted strikes, mapped in advance. The pattern was textbook professional. Suppress the overwatch, isolate the convoy, destroy it piece by piece, while the Americans burned through ammunition, shooting at shadows. Intelligence had been right about one thing. They were facing someone who understood NATO tactics well enough to turn them into death traps. The SEALs opened up, rifles cracking in controlled bursts, but they were firing blind, sending rounds toward muzzle flashes that winked and vanished before anyone could zero in. The valley walls echoed with gunfire, each report bouncing until it was impossible to tell direction from distortion. "We can't see them," Danner shouted, squeezing off a burst toward a shadow that disappeared the second he aimed. "They're buried in the rock." Ridley dropped behind cover, face a mask of frustration. He keyed his throat mic. Convoy, this is Overwatch Ridge. Enemy fire active. No positive ID on shooters. Repeat, no line of sight. The response came garbled, but desperation cut through the static. We're pinned, taking fire from multiple, need cover. Then a different voice, younger, scared. This is Convoy 6-2. Lead vehicle's burning. We've got wounded who can't move. They've got us zeroed from 3 positions. The radio went dead, except for the crackle of flames and distant gunfire. Ridley slammed a fist into stone. Damn it, they're dead in the water if we can't mark targets. Another explosion rocked the ridge. Stone shards whipped through air, stinging faces and arms. One man ducked late and caught a jagged splinter across his cheek, blood already streaming. The medic yanked him behind a boulder, wrapping a bandage with hands that trembled only slightly. Claire hadn't moved. She crouched near the ridge edge, eyes sweeping opposite slopes. Calm in the chaos. Her gaze lingered not on muzzle flashes or smoke, but on a far ridgeline, half hidden by heat shimmer. Kowalski noticed. Between firing bursts, he muttered to Ridley, "She keeps looking east, like she sees something." Ridley barely spared her a glance. "She doesn't see anything. She's logistics." He raised his voice. "Keep your sectors. No one breaks position." Claire didn't argue. She just adjusted her stance slightly, squinting into the distance like she was tracing invisible lines only she could read. Another round landed closer. The ridge shook beneath their boots. The convoy crackled over radio again, this time frantic. "We can't hold. Repeat, we cannot hold without Overwatch." Ridley ground his teeth, eyes sweeping terrain that gave him nothing. Just dust, smoke, and ghosts hidden among rocks. He spat into dirt and said what every man had already thought. "No line of sight. We're shooting shadows." Behind him, Claire's eyes stayed locked on that far ridge. She didn't say a word. Not yet. The next mortar round hit closer, blast rattling teeth and driving hot dust over the ridge. Pebbles rained on helmets. Someone cursed as rock shards glanced off his arm. Then the next one came, closer still. "Move! Get him down!" Kowalski dove toward Danner, shoving him flat as shrapnel sang through air. A jagged piece punched into Danner's calf. He cried out, gripping the wound as Kowalski ripped open a trauma kit, bandaging fast under fire. The ridgeline was chaos now. Dust clouds rolled over positions, blinding eyes, choking lungs. Air stank of cordite and broken stone. The SEALs fired back anyway, every round precise, every movement drilled. But precision meant nothing when there was no target. Radio flared again, convoy voices tight with panic. "Overwatch! Multiple hits! Vehicles disabled! Casualties mounting! We can't—" The rest broke into static as another explosion swallowed the transmission. Ridley slammed his palm against rock hard enough to leave blood. "We've got nothing!" he said through gritted teeth. For the first time, the men heard it in his voice. Not anger, but helplessness. Helplessness was foreign to these men. They'd clawed through ambushes, fought house to house in cities built to kill them, dragged brothers from burning vehicles under fire. But right now, on this ridge, they were blind. Blind men fighting shadows. The next shell impacted so close, the mountain shuddered. A concussive wave lifted one operator half off his feet, slamming him back into cover. Kowalski dragged him by the vest, swearing, "Stay with me," as dust poured down like ash. Claire didn't flinch. She crouched lower, eyes fixed on the ridgeline she hadn't looked away from since the first shot. Then, as if she'd been waiting for the right moment, her voice cut through chaos, calm and clear. "What's your longest confirmed shot from this ridge?" The question hung there, absurd against exploding shells. Ridley blinked, twisting toward her. "What?" Claire repeated, steady as ever. "Longest confirmed shot from this ridge." One of the younger SEALs barked a laugh, short and sharp, more nerves than humor. "There's no shot, ma'am. We've tried every angle, every optic, nothing to hit." Another added, "You can't thread a bullet through smoke and stone." "Not here." Ridley shook his head, dust streaking his face. "We've got no line of sight. That's the problem." Claire studied him for a moment, then nodded once, like she'd confirmed something in her mind. She set her clipboard aside, battered metal clattering against stone. Her hands went to her rucksack, tugging at straps. "Then I'll make one," she said quietly. The words stopped them colder than mortars had. No bravado, no challenge. Just simple fact. And then, while shrapnel still hissed against stone and the valley echoed with hidden fire, she began unpacking her rucksack. The rucksack came open with a sound like tearing fabric. Canvas strained against weight inside. Instead of supply forms or maps, Claire pulled out a long, oil-wrapped bundle. She laid it gently on stone, hands moving with deliberate calm that belonged to people who'd done this 1,000 times before. The SEALs fell silent. Even distant mortar thunder seemed muted as they watched. She unwrapped the bundle. Black steel gleamed dully in half-light, massive and unmistakable. A Barrett M82A1, 50 caliber sniper rifle, one of the heaviest, longest-reaching rifles in service. Not standard issue for a logistics observer. Not something you carried unless you knew exactly what to do with it. Chief Ridley's throat worked. "Where the hell did you get that?" Claire ignored him. She reached into the rucksack again, drawing out bipod sandbag rest and a box of carefully sealed ammunition. Each movement was precise, efficient. Muscle memory so ingrained it looked almost ritualistic. Kowalski stared, voice low. "That's not fresh issue, that's broken in." Ridley's irritation flared, laced with unease. "This isn't your lane, ma'am. You're not cleared for Overwatch." Still, she didn't respond. Instead, she pulled a small chalk pouch from the rucksack and sprinkled dust into wind. She watched how it scattered, how it curled through unseen currents and dipped into the valley's folds. Then she bent close to the rifle, adjusting elevation by fractions, turning the scope's turret with the gentleness of someone tuning a delicate instrument. The men exchanged glances. They knew what proper setup looked like. And this wasn't improvisation. This was mastery. "Hell," Danner muttered under his breath, wincing as Kowalski tightened the bandage around his leg. "She's done this before." Claire settled into position, lying flat against stone. Barrett angled downslope at what looked like a wall of haze and rock. The spot was terrible for survival. Exposed, little cover, but it gave her the one thing none of the others had found. A thread of sight. A window so narrow it seemed impossible to use. Ridley crouched beside her, still trying to assert control. This ridge has no shot. We've all tried. You're wasting time we don't have. She adjusted again, squinting through the scope, finger light against the trigger guard. I'm not trying your angles, she said quietly. I'm making my own. Her words carried the same calm she'd had since arriving. No heat, no arrogance, just certainty. The kind that came from experience most people never heard about. Santos leaned forward to watch her calculations, brow furrowed. He caught fragments. She was measuring heat shimmer like a clock, compensating for acoustic delays, noting wind gust rhythms that bent smoke flags in consistent patterns. She was reading terrain like a language, each adjustment a syllable. Ridley stared at her, unsettled. This wasn't logistics. This wasn't observation. This was something else. Something buried deeper than clearance levels. Claire slid around into the chamber with a smooth metallic click. The Barrett looked monstrous in her hands, a weapon meant for distances most people couldn't comprehend. Yet she handled it like an extension of her body, settling her cheek to the stock, exhaling once, long and steady. Targets are masked, Ridley said, trying to tether her back to impossible reality. You can't even see them. I can see enough, she replied. She lifted her head slightly, eyes flicking once more across the valley. Then she returned to the scope, tone almost conversational, like calling a weather report. Winds breaking cross at 800, adjusting 0.3 left. Thermal shimmer gives me 15-second windows. That's all I need. The SEALs exchanged another uneasy glance. Her language was too fluent, too specific. No one spoke like that unless they'd lived behind a scope for years. Santos leaned toward Ridley, voice low. Chief, that's not logistics talk. That's sniper school. Thermal crossover compensation, Kowalski muttered, watching Claire make micro adjustments. That's advanced core stuff. Like really advanced. Ridley wanted to push back, but another mortar round boomed closer, rattling the ridge. The convoy below was running out of time. Claire didn't look up, didn't flinch. She just shifted her body a fraction, breathed, and kept her eye locked on the scope. For the first time since the ambush began, the SEALs stopped firing into shadows. They waited, watching her, not the valley, because something in the stillness of her posture told them the battle was about to change. The ridge seemed to hold its breath. Even the SEALs, men trained to keep moving under fire, froze, eyes shifting toward the woman lying prone behind the Barrett. Down in the valley, the convoy braced for another barrage. Engines revved uselessly, tires shredded, armored doors slammed as men huddled against explosions they couldn't stop. Smoke curled in thick banners through the pass, turning daylight into a shifting gray cage. Claire's voice was low, almost conversational, though the rifle beneath her shook with restrained power. Mortar teams repositioning. Watch for a lull, then count to 3. Ridley leaned beside her, baffled. You can't see through that mess. She didn't answer, didn't need to. The lull came, just a flicker in fire rhythm, the barest pause as enemy loaders shifted another shell into the tube. Claire whispered, 3, 2. The Barrett roared. It was a sound like a thunderclap rolling through metal, deep, physical, rattling bones as much as ears. Dust leapt from the ridge in a halo around her. Recoil thumped her shoulder, but her body didn't budge. Half a second later, a figure on the opposite ridgeline crumpled sideways across a mortar tube, arms flailing, once before going still. The entire firing line around him wavered, uncertain, like they couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The mortar fire went silent. The SEALs stared. None of them had seen the man. Not the silhouette, not the muzzle flash, nothing but haze and stone. But she had. Claire cycled the action, chambering another round with mechanical grace of someone who never wasted movement. She adjusted her scope by a fraction, nudged the bipod with her boot, and settled again. "Sniper nest," she murmured, voice so steady it sounded detached. "Eastern cliff, 20 feet below the crest. Watch the glint." The others squinted, rifles scanning desperately. They saw nothing but sunlight catching on haze. The Barrett cracked again. The sound bounced off cliffs in rolling echoes. A heartbeat later, a body tumbled limp from an outcropping the SEALs hadn't even identified as a hide. Kowalski blinked hard. Jesus Christ. She threaded that through heat shimmer. Danner, pale from blood loss but still watching, whispered, "That's not luck. That's years." Another adjustment. Another shot. Another enemy silenced. The bullet punching through rock cover like it was paper. 3 minutes. That's all it took. In that short span, Claire dismantled positions the SEALs had been blind to all morning. Mortar tubes lay silent. Snipers who had owned the ridges now sprawled in dust. The invisible enemy that had pinned them down was suddenly bleeding, exposed, scrambling. Chief Ridley rose halfway from cover, scanning with new eyes. She's clearing them," he muttered, disbelief thick in his voice. The SEALs, who'd been firing blind into smoke and rock, began lifting weapons again with purpose. They weren't alone anymore. They had Overwatch, real Overwatch. Claire's breathing remained calm, movements unhurried. She fired, adjusted, fired again, each round deliberate. No spray, no waste. Every bullet counted. By the 5th kill, the battlefield had changed completely. The convoy below was moving again, cautiously at first, then with momentum. The SEALs on the ridge pressed forward, confidence returning with every shot Claire fired. Ridley crouched beside her, eyes still on the valley. His tone was low, almost reverent. "We had no line of sight." Claire didn't look up from the scope. She chambered another round, face unreadable. "Now you do." The Barrett's barrel smoked gently in thin mountain air, each new crack of thunder, a reminder that the fight had shifted. And for the first time all day, the SEALs weren't shooting shadows anymore. They were fighting with eyes and a rifle that saw through the impossible. Enemy fighters who'd owned the ridgeline an hour earlier were now scrambling, abandoning firing nests as the Barrett barked again and again. Some tried to shift positions, darting from rock to rock. Others attempted to drag wounded comrades deeper into cover. Each movement gave them away, and each time Claire marked it, her rifle spoke. "Left ridge," she said calmly, not raising her voice over wind. 40 meters below the cairn. He's moving low. Ridley didn't argue anymore. He trusted her words without hesitation, swinging his rifle and laying down covering fire before he'd even spotted the figure. Another SEAL shifted with him, and together they pinned the fighter until Claire's shot punched through the rock he'd hidden behind. Silence followed. It was a rhythm now. Her voice. Their movement. Barrett thunder closing each sequence. Kowalski grinned, despite blood still soaking his sleeves. "Feels like we've got God's own artillery up here." Ridley shot him a glance. Not artillery, one woman with a scope. Below, the convoy began to rally. Vehicles that had been hunkered down started to inch forward, their movements shielded by Claire's precision. She wasn't just eliminating threats. She was shaping the battlefield, forcing the enemy into predictable movements, carving safe passage where none had existed minutes before. Machine gun fire burst from the western slope, chewing dirt into gazers near the convoy. Claire didn't flinch. She shifted her scope, exhaled, and sent a round that tore through the nest. The weapon fell silent instantly. Ridley finally understood. She wasn't guessing. Every shot, every correction was backed by knowledge deeper than any logistics observer should possess. She was working like a long-range infiltration operator, one of the rare specialists trained to solve problems nobody else could even see. The SEALs moved under her cover fire, confidence renewed. Santos dragged Danner further behind the boulder, hands steady now, not frantic. Kowalski advanced to a new perch, barking target calls with renewed strength. Every man was steadier because she was steady. And Claire, face calm, breath measured, movements exact, kept firing. Down in the valley, the convoy pushed through the pass. Tires bit gravel, engines roared, and radios crackled with relief as vehicles broke free of the kill zone. The men below cheered, voices faint but clear over comms. On the ridge, Ridley lowered his rifle just long enough to glance at Claire. "They're moving. They're alive because of you." She didn't answer. She chambered another round, eye never leaving the scope. Another enemy figure shifted in her sights. The Barrett thundered again. The ridgeline echoed with silence that hadn't existed all day. No more mortar rounds. No more hidden snipers. Just the sound of gravel rolling under boots and the faint hum of wind. Claire let her finger ease off the trigger and exhaled slowly. "Convoy's clear," she said, voice as steady as if she'd been calling in weather. Ridley's jaw tightened. He wasn't easily impressed, but the weight of what he'd just witnessed pressed harder than mountain air. She had given them sight where there had been none, and she had done it with the calm certainty of someone who'd been carrying this skill in silence for years. For the first time that day, the battlefield belonged to them. The ridgeline was still, not the tense, suffocating stillness from earlier when every shadow seemed to hide a rifle, but the kind that came after violence had burned itself out. Dust settled in lazy spirals. Smoke thinned into wind. The silence felt almost foreign, like the mountain was trying to remember what it sounded like before war. Claire eased her cheek from the Barrett stock and let the rifle rest against the sandbag. The long barrel smoked faintly, heat shimmering off steel. She exhaled slowly, calm and deliberate, and began breaking the weapon down with the same precision she'd shown setting it up. Magazine out, chamber cleared, scope capped, each movement steady, unhurried, like she had all the time in the world. The SEALs didn't move at first. They just watched her. Men who'd fought in every kind of hell imaginable stared at a logistics officer who just saved them with shots they hadn't even seen. Ridley was the first to speak, voice lower than usual, stripped of its earlier edge. "Who trained you?" Claire glanced up briefly, expression unreadable, then returned to sliding the rifle into its case. "Long-range logistics," she said simply, "for operations that don't exist on paper." The words hung in the air. No embellishment, no arrogance, just fact. Santos let out a low whistle, shaking his head. Hell of a resume line. Ridley didn't smile. He crouched in front of her close enough to see the calm in her eyes. He searched for something to say, something that could reconcile the woman with a clipboard who'd arrived that morning with the quiet professional who just threaded death through smoke and rock. Words failed him. Claire snapped the case shut with a metallic click. She slung it across her shoulder like it weighed nothing, then stood. "Convoy's clear. Your men are intact. Mission's complete." Ridley stared at her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he reached into a pouch on his vest and pulled out a morale patch. A SEAL trident, frayed at the edges, worn soft from years of sweat and sand. He pressed it against the rifle case strapped across her back. "That stays with it," he said quietly. "Consider it recognition." The men around him nodded. No one clapped, no one cheered, but the looks in their eyes were louder than any applause. Respect, sharp and unspoken, the kind that couldn't be faked or forced. Claire gave no response. She simply adjusted the strap, the patch still fixed to the case, and turned her gaze back toward the valley below. Her face was the same calm mask it had been since the start. But every man on that ridge knew something had changed. By nightfall, the ridge was empty. The SEALs had been rotated out, the convoy pushed safely through, and the battlefield reclaimed its silence as if nothing had happened there at all. Only scarred stone and scattered brass casings bore witness to what had unfolded. The after-action report was filed 2 days later, 3 pages long, dense with acronyms and sterile phrasing. Enemy fire silenced by combined arms coordination. Overwatch provided adequate coverage to ensure convoy passage. Enemy withdrew after sustaining undetermined casualties. There was no mention of Warrant Officer Claire Redden. No mention of a Barrett rifle, or shots threading through smoke, or the fact that a single woman had shifted the balance of a battle that should have been lost. On paper, she didn't exist. Her quarters at the forward operating base were cleared overnight. Travel orders appeared with the date already stamped. Her name was checked off the roster before the men on the ridge had even unpacked their rucks. By morning, it was as though she'd never set foot there. But memory didn't vanish so easily. In the days that followed, word spread quietly through the community, not through official channels, but in the way warriors tell each other truths that reports will never carry. A phrase began to circulate, whispered over chow, muttered in gear rooms, scratched onto notebook backs. Raise the Barrett. It wasn't an order, not really. It was a reminder, a saying that meant, when you think you're blind, when the fight looks impossible, someone might still see what you can't. Chief Ridley kept the patched rifle case in his memory, as clearly as the scars on his hands. When new operators asked about the phrase, he'd only shake his head and say, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." And somewhere, far from the ridge, Claire Redden disappeared back into shadows where she belonged. Not forgotten, but unrecorded. The kind of professional the world never acknowledged, but the men who'd lived because of her would never let themselves forget. What would you have thought watching her unpack that Barrett in the middle of chaos? Do you believe hidden professionals like her exist all around us, carrying skills nobody ever sees until the moment it matters most? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. If this story kept you hooked, make sure you tap that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss tomorrow's upload. Share this video with someone who knows appearances can be deceiving because they'll want to hear this one. Our other stories are already on your screen now. Click one to keep watching, and we'll see you tomorrow at the same time with another reminder that quiet strength changes everything.